Pancake, everyone! Did you know that originally tomatoes were not included in the composition of ketchup? Don't make things up, you might say. Well, it's true. Ketchup was the name for a spice mixture in a Chinese recipe for a sauce made from pickled fish. When the British reached those lands in the 18th century, they adopted this exotic sauce but made some changes to it. And no, they didn't add tomatoes. Their version of ketchup consisted of mushrooms, walnuts, and mussels. It was in the British colony, which eventually became the United States, that this sauce became tomato-based. How about that? Do you think you can surprise your friends with this? In today's video, we have gathered some facts for you that are not taught in history lessons. And some textbooks even mislead about certain things. And one of these facts is undoubtedly the height of Napoleon Bonaparte. Jokes are made about it. Some claim that his short stature was the cause of his ambitions, and even a complex about his height was named after Napoleon. But was it really the case? In reality, Napoleon was not short. There are preserved records from doctors who examined him posthumously, and these records tell us that Napoleon was above average height for his contemporaries. Where did the mistake come from? It's likely due to the difference between French and British feet. Napoleon's height in the French measurement system was 5 feet 2 inches, but the French foot was longer than the British foot. The British, not paying much attention to the details, simply looked for a reason to mock their enemy and found it in his height. Caricatures, pamphlets, and the entire power of art and newspapers were directed at humiliating this dangerous adversary. Yes, a height of 1 meter 70 centimeters cannot be considered very tall. The world has seen taller rulers, but Napoleon was not as short-legged as depicted in pop culture. Scientists speculate that the nickname Little Corporal stuck to Napoleon because he appeared younger than his years and simply did not seem tall to his contemporaries. Perhaps you have heard about this in lessons about ancient Greece. Maybe you've seen it in movies or read about it somewhere. Those dreadful stories about how Spartans would throw weak infants off cliffs. Did it really happen? Well, the answer is no. Modern researchers have reached the ravine where supposedly unhealthy infants unable to endure the harsh Spartan life were thrown. Scientists examined the remains and found out that the majority of them belonged to men aged 18 to 35. So where did this misconception come from? Most likely for a long time, the only source of knowledge about the customs and laws of Spartans were stories told by Athenian citizens, their bitterest enemies and direct rivals for dominance on the peninsula. And let's tread on historical stereotypes some more. For a long time, Vikings were portrayed as savage warriors, northern invaders wearing horned helmets. But was it really the case? Yes, Vikings conducted armed raids and were fierce warriors, but they were also explorers, pioneers, and traders. There is evidence that Vikings reached the shores of North America in their expeditions long before various renowned Europeans did. Vikings were also fishermen and engaged in agriculture. Over time, the cooling climate in Europe, which we'll discuss in more detail, made grain cultivation more difficult, and they began to lead a more settled way of life. And as for horned helmets, those were invented by followers of Romanticism in the 19th century. The real helmets of the Vikings did not have them. And since we've touched upon the medieval European climate, would you like to bet that for most people the ice ages are associated with mammoths and saber-toothed tigers? Thanks Blue Sky Studios? A lesser-known fact is that a period of minor glaciation occurred between 1300 and 1850, and this little ice age was no less significant. Nearly 500 years of low temperatures that had a profound impact on various aspects of people's lives at that time. Primarily, it affected agriculture, as traditional cultivation methods for vegetables, grains, and fruits were no longer sufficient. This led to famine and political instability, which in turn contributed to the formation of countries in a more or less familiar way. The Little Ice Age also influenced the visual arts with its winter landscapes and frozen Thames paintings. Additionally, the cooling had an impact on the Vikings' presence in Greenland. It was impossible to engage in agricultural activities in such cold conditions. And since we've mentioned mammoths, do you know what rarely crosses the minds of students while studying history textbooks? That many events described in those textbooks happened around the same time. For example, if mammoths had inhabited the banks of the Nile, they could have easily witnessed the construction of the most famous of all pyramids, the Egyptian pyramids of Giza. The math is simple. The pyramids took their final shape somewhere between 2600 and 2300 BCE. Meanwhile, the woolly mammoths, which appeared 300,000 years ago, finally went extinct around the 2000s BCE. You could say that they had plenty of time to reach the pyramids and admire them. but the southernmost point of the woolly mammoths migration is currently considered to be Spain. However, if mammoths could have reached there, they would undoubtedly have seen these majestic structures. And since we've started talking about pyramid construction using the same mathematical approach, we can discover something interesting. For instance, the famous Egyptian queen Cleopatra lived and orchestrated her intrigues from 69 to 30 BCE. As we have already determined, the most famous pyramids of ancient Egypt were built between 2600 and 2300 BCE. This means that there is a gap of more than 2,200 years between the pyramids and Queen Cleopatra. Meanwhile, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon in 1969. In terms of the chronology of historical events, this puts Cleopatra 200 years closer to the moon landing than to the construction of the pyramids. And while we're at it, let's dot the I's and cross the T's. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. Yes, that Cleopatra VII, the last ruling queen of Ptolemaic Egypt, is often depicted in popular culture and art as an exotic Eastern beauty. However, in reality, Cleopatra did not have Egyptian roots, but was a descendant of Ptolemy, one of the generals of Alexander the Great, who took control of Egypt after the king's death. Although ethnically Cleopatra was more Greek than Egyptian, she was the first of the Ptolemies to learn the Egyptian language and embrace the culture of the country. But let's step away from mathematics, calculations, and numbers because we have a story that you probably didn't hear in school unless you live in Australia, because that's where it all happened. The Australian government, in an effort to address a problem that was causing concern among the population, launched an operation to combat emus. While farmers struggled and cultivated the sometimes infertile land of Australia, emus decided that this land would be suitable for their life and reproduction. According to farmers' accounts, these birds multiplied so rapidly that they began ravaging crops, which could potentially lead to famine. For the operation, the Australian government enlisted soldiers from the Royal Artillery, even appointing a major to oversee it. However, neither on the first nor the second attempt did armed soldiers manage to handle the hordes of agile non-flying birds who could dodge bullets surprisingly well. They turned the army into a laughingstock. The soldiers used machine guns to shoot the emus. By the end of the operation, the major stated that a total of 986 emus were killed, and it took nearly 10,000 rounds of ammunition. This raised doubts about the effectiveness of such measures. Farmers again approached the government with the emu problem in 1934, 1943, and 1948. But given the public discontent and the wave of media publications criticizing such actions, it was ultimately decided to abandon further attempts. And a bit more about killings. Specifically, one very famous case. You have probably heard that Mozart was poisoned by his rival Salieri out of envy for his genius. The story goes that Salieri, feeling inferior and seeing how everything came easily to Mozart, couldn't bear it any longer and decided to poison the prodigy. But that's just a fairy tale, written by a very famous storyteller. In reality, Salieri had absolutely no motive. He was successful in his own right, holding a respected position at the imperial court, and among his pupils were geniuses like Schubert, Beethoven, and Liszt. There was no reason for him to be envious of the destitute Mozart for money either. So what was the truth then? Pushkin once heard a rumor that Salieri, who by that time had become mentally unstable and was living in a mental asylum, confessed to poisoning Mozart. And while we're not going far away, the trial of Salieri did happen, albeit 172 years after his death. In 1997, in Milan, a hearing was held to determine whether Salieri could have killed Mozart. Due to the lack of motive, Salieri was acquitted. During the trial, it also emerged that the doctor who certified Mozart's death attributed it to a common illness of that time, dropsy. Since we've started talking about illnesses, let's discuss the plague. No, it wasn't invented or brought by aliens. We'll talk about a different kind of plague. In 1518, as we have already established, it was a turbulent time. And in the midst of this turbulence, in July, a real dance mania erupted in the city of Strasbourg. It started with one woman, but quickly spread to a large number of townspeople. For a whole month, 400 people couldn't control their urge to dance or stop themselves. They danced day and night without breaks until they collapsed from exhaustion, and some even died from it. The scholars of that time attributed it to divine punishment and an unusual cause, boiling blood. However, modern scientists believe it was a manifestation of mass hysteria or a result of poisoning from a hallucinogenic fungus ergot in the wheat used for making bread. Bread can be deadly, either its absence or its excess. If you have always thought that it's impossible to feed someone to death, that it's just a horror movie myth, you will be greatly surprised now. The Kingdom of Sweden is ruled by Adolf Frederick, who decides to celebrate the end of Lent in grand style. In Sweden, this holiday is called Fat Thursday. The celebration was to be a feast, and the table was overflowing with delicious dishes: zucchini soup with slices of beef, everything so tender as if just born, lobsters, sauerkraut with frozen lingonberries, smoked herring and caviar is a must. For dessert, 14 enriched buns and champagne. Even before dessert, the king realized that he had eaten enough. But the buns with cream and almond paste, he couldn't resist the temptation. And yes, he ate them all, although his stomach was already protesting and feeling bloated. The naive king thought that the best remedy would be an afternoon nap. However, the incompatible ingredients and a stomach unaccustomed to fatty food during Lent took their toll, and Adolf Frederick entered the annals of world monarchs as the only king who died from overeating. The Great Wall of China is often associated with the idea of a defense against nomadic tribes, invaders, and Mongols. However, as historians tell us, it served not only a defensive purpose. Stretching for many kilometers, the structures regulated trade on the Great Silk Road. As early as 221 BCE, it was used for controlling the entry and exit of citizens and collecting taxes from merchants. Even the watchtowers were transformed into customs checkpoints. And while we're at it, many have probably heard that the Great Wall of China is almost the only man-made object visible from space. First and foremost, we should note that from a purely technical standpoint, only a couple of factors can hinder this: the camera's zoom and weather conditions. However, when discussing this fact, it is often mentioned that it can be seen with the naked eye. Here we can confidently say that NASA astronauts claim it is impossible. And it's easy to understand why. Despite its staggering lengths, the wall's width varies from 5 to 8 meters. Simply put, the wall is not massive enough to be seen from space just like that. Speaking of another great structure, or rather a system of structures, the aqueduct in ancient Rome was one of the greatest engineering achievements of its time. Contrary to popular belief, the complex system of aqueducts and pipelines was not invented from scratch by the Romans, but rather perfected by them using stone and lead pipes. Monumental structures were created by people to transport water for many kilometers from sources to Roman cities and settlements. In Rome alone, there were 11 aqueducts supplying water to public baths, fountains, and private homes. But bringing water to the city was not enough. Rome was also known for one of the earliest and undoubtedly powerful sewage systems called the Cloaca Maxima. In ancient Rome, they were obsessed with the development of mass drainage systems and personal hygiene. All of this, of course, was done to prevent the spread of diseases, which could easily decimate the entire city's population. But what other impacts could such a water supply system have besides disease prevention? Let's start with the fact that we cannot ignore the use of lead pipes to deliver water to the city. The scholars of that time simply did not know about the harmful effects of such contact. Lead contaminated the water, entered the human body, and remained there. Modern researchers even suggest that this served as one of the reasons for the subsequent decline of the empire. Well, we hope you have learned something new and fascinating today. Until next time on the channel,